Hi, today I had the chance to review a number 4 of the new Axminster Rider series of planes. I should point out that unlike my previous tool reviews, on this occasion I haven't purchased the tool myself. Axminster have provided me the plane from stock on the understanding that I perform a review. They've also offered to donate a tool for an upcoming competition that I will be running. But have no concerns, I've been as impartial as ever. I've recorded an out-of-the-box review, including the effect of a quick hone on the blade. I've checked machining, ergonomics, appearance and performance, and I hope you find it interesting. So let's start by unwrapping it. Well, it's arrived in a lovely presentation box. I've got an instruction book that covers an introduction, short history, general care and maintenance, sharpening plane blades, adjusting the rider bench plane, and then covers the rest of the Axminster Rider plane range. So that'll be an interesting little read. There's some foam packing in here, so it looks like it's very well protected. And there's a nice plain sock. That'll help protect it if you're carrying it around in the toolbox. And here's the plane itself. First notice that it's nice and heavy. It's got some rust inhibiting paper on there. All looks good at first sight. And there's also a spare blade. I don't use plain socks myself because I work in the workshop and I'm not carrying them around with me very often. But that fits nicely in there and it's quite thick. It will afford it a fair amount of protection, I think. So let's take a closer look at the plane. What caught my attention straight away was how heavy it is, which for a smoother is a real advantage, and also for shooting. The lever cap is tightened with a knurled screw. It's of heavy brass construction, quite nicely polished on the top. The blade and chip breaker, first thing to note is how thick they are. The face of the frog is nicely machined, looks very smooth. We'll check it for flatness a little later. The depth adjuster is made of brass, nice and wide, got good grip on it, very positive feel. I'm just trying for any backlash against the screw that it works on, and there's very little indeed. The yoke, the rounds at the end of the yoke that connect with the wheel, they're a little bit slack in the groove of the wheel, but what I do notice is that the yoke itself, where it's hinged in the frog, seems to be very loose on the pin. So that might indicate we have quite a range of motion of the wheel before we actually move the blade, but we'll check that out a little bit later. The lateral adjuster has been pressed out of sheet steel. It's been nicely bent round at the top here, which makes it nice and comfortable to use. It feels a little bit soft, but we'll see whether that affects it in use a little bit later. The front and back handles are nicely shaped. Being a number 4, the rear handles perhaps a little bit smaller. It really is a 3-finger job for me, but I can easily adjust the depth of cut with my middle finger. I just run my fingertips around the edges of the plane to check for any potentially sharp and dangerous spots. And that's nice. The corner between the sole and the side of the plane appears to have been knocked off slightly to take away the very sharp edge, so there's no danger of hurting yourself there. The front bottom corners again seem to have received a little bit of treatment, a little bit of beveling, and they're quite soft to the touch as well. The lower rear corners are just a little bit sharp, and I would want to knock those off a little bit on some wet and dry paper. The mating surfaces between the body of the plane and the frog have been nicely machined, and the fit is extremely good. Sadly, the head of the frog adjustment screw has been damaged during manufacture, and there's a sharp shard on there that needs filing off. I think it's time to get my straight edge and tri-square out just to check the geometry. Starting with the side, it's looking pretty good. There's absolutely no way I can get a 1.5 thou feeler gauge in there. I'm going to shine a light on it from behind. I think you can see that there's clearly no glaringly obvious gaps in there. Checking the other side of the plane, it is possible just to see, hope the camera's catching this, just a little bit, tiniest streak of light through there, which is what I would expect with even the best quality planes. So one side is excellent, the other side is very good. Taking a look at the sole of the plane, definitely no 1.5 thou gaps along there. If I try and shine a light through now, not sure if you see anything at all. There is a tiny bit up towards the back of the mouth. The mouth doesn't seem to have any light coming through. I'm just going to check the diagonals now. And that tells a very similar story. It's not perfect, but it is very flat. Now I've got a 1.5 thou feeler gauge here. That's not fitting in at all along the toe. Behind the mouth is good. Then about 1 inch back from the mouth, it's slipping under. And it continues to do that until about 2 inches from the heel. I just check the left hand side of the sole. And that's better. Slipping under just a little bit there. And I'll check the right hand side of the sole as well. And that's good. I'll just point out I have got the blade in and under tension. Checking the diagonals, I've got the gauge going under on the toe until just before the mouth, and that seems fine towards the back of the plane. The opposite diagonal, just slipping under in the middle of the toe, and it gets tight just at the mouth, and then quite easy to get the gauge under through the middle of the plane and tight again towards the rear corner. So for finished planing of cabinetry, you'd want to do a bit of work on the bottom of this plane to get rid of those little gaps. But for general work, tradesmen, hobbyists, etc., that's more than close enough for some decent work. Checking for square, I think we can see there is a definite gap there, and 4.5 thou is just about going in, and that's much better. 3 won't go in, 2 just slips in on the extreme tip of the wing. Correcting that very slight discrepancy would mean possibly rubbing away some of this nicely etched marking on the side. The face of the frog is lovely and flat. Now let's just check the blade for flat. And we can see it's got a slight hollow in it of, I'd say, just over 4 thou. More importantly, at least I feel, across the width of the blade I can't get 1.5 thou in. If I shine a light from behind, I'm not actually seeing any light come through. So from that point of view, I think we should have a nice sharp blade, or the ability to have a nice sharp blade. Another important factor is how well the chip breaker fits to the blade. It's quite difficult to arrange to film how tight that gap is, but I'm going to hold it up to the light and see if I can see anything. I don't know whether you're seeing a gap there. I can see a very small amount of light creeping through. Engineering wise, I'm very impressed with this plane. Given its price, it seems to be very high specification. But let's actually try it and see how it works in practice. I've got a piece of Iroko here, and I'm using the plane straight out of the box. I've made no adjustments to it at all in regards to frog position, and I haven't honed the blade at all either. Just put a tiny bit of wax on the sole. And that's not a bad finish. So that's making quite a good job now on this cherry. Actually leaving it pretty smooth. And remember, that's straight out of the box. I haven't honed this blade, so not too bad. That's taking nice thick shavings straight out of the box. I can tell by the sound of it and the amount of energy I'm having to put in to take a shaving that it could do with a hone. So I thought I'd just do a little experiment to compare the friction of the sole of the Rider plane straight from the factory compared to my own Stanley No.4, whose sole I prepared about a year ago. They're both resting on a flat piece of MDF, and I'll just raise it up slowly and we'll see which one slides under its own weight the quickest. So quite clearly a little bit more friction on the Rider bench plane. But of course that experiment doesn't take into account the plane's weight, which will also have an effect. So let's just weigh them. The Rider comes in at, on these scales, dead on 2 kilograms, and my Stanley at 1.6 kilograms. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to hone the edge of the blade and see how much better it works after that. Well, I timed myself and that took no more than 1 minute and 15 seconds. Quickly go on the fine India stone and honing on MDF with paste. And that's cutting a lot nicer. That's a similar thickness shaving to before, but a little bit easier to push. Now if I wind the blade up a bit, we'll see how fine a shaving we can get. Well, that's pretty good. I'll just get my calipers and measure that. And that's measuring spot on 0.02 millimeters. Pushing a shaving of 0.2 millimeters was really quite easy too. You can see there's a bit of tear out here where the grain obviously changes direction. That tear out was obviously from the thicker shaving that I took. You see whether taking these thin shavings can get rid of that. Certainly seems to be improving. And I can't see anything there now. So that nice thick blade, freshly honed, is managing to cope with the tear out okay. The surface finish is absolutely fabulous, which just goes to show that these blades take a really nice edge. So just running through my likes of the plane, the flatness of the sole and the sides is great, at within 1.5 thou from my measurements. The squareness of the sides to the sole, which I found to be within 0.15 degrees. The heft of the plane at 2 kilograms. The rosewood handles, the brass fittings, the thickness of the chip breaker and the iron, both at 3 millimeters, and the lovely edge that the blade could take with a bit of honing, and the fact that it will actually work pretty well straight out of the box. My dislikes were that there are sharp trailing corners on the sole. I didn't like the pressed steel yoke, I'd rather have seen a cast one. The slackness in the yoke hinge, which impacted on the amount of slack in the depth adjustment. I would prefer to have had a lever on the lever cap rather than the screw, and also the pivot point for the lever cap, I would have preferred a round head rather than a cheesehead screw. And finally, and this is a very personal one, I would prefer a matte japanning rather than gloss. In summary, for a similar price to a new Stanley No.4 plus a Stanley blade and a plane sock, you get a plane which has a whole lot of heft, that is machined to tight tolerances and has lovely rosewood handles plus the spare blade and the sock. Most users should find that the plane comes ready for their particular use with no tedious preparatory work to do. For those wanting premium quality plane performance, this plane represents a good starting point for fine tuning.